Welcome, everybody, to the Quantum Analyst Roundtable, Season 1, Episode 7. Joined by my fellow friends and experts, David Shaw, Doug Finke, Shahin, James, and myself. How's everybody doing? David, we were just making fun of you sitting in the British heat. The UK is 10 degrees warmer than my home, Miami Beach.
No, we're not used to it over here. We can't cope at all. It's getting back to normal now.
I'll send you a dilution refrigerator, David.
An old one, an old recycled one.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's doing well. I hope so is our audience. Let's start to take a look at the news. And we'll get started with a little investment roundup. There has been some activity. Boson Cube Psi out of India raised a small pre-seed round of a little more than $500,000 US. More importantly, our friend Ilana Wispy raised $47 million for Oxford Quantum Circuits. And some larger deals happening, but I know that Orca, of course, raised money as well. In our preparation, there was a little bit of sentiment of what's currently going on in the fundraising universe, and I see at least 3 nodding heads. So take it away.
Yeah, I just think it's the thing everyone's been talking about is it's difficult at the moment in the market. The tech markets, got challenges. It's a challenge to get quantum offerings to revenue, and particularly the expectations are maybe not going in the most favorable direction in some quarters. We've had hype, etc., and that makes fundraising difficult. It makes investors want to wait, because actually sometimes maybe investors think there'll be bargains coming down the aisle. One of the things that really I took from seeing both how the Orca funding was completed and the Oxford Quantum Circuits funding was completed, and congratulations to Richard and Ilana on both of those, getting them away. Very interesting to see the involvement of state-related funding in both of those. The not directly for Orca, but in the involvement of the MOD in putting that imprint on this is a technology they wanted to be involved with, and also in Oxford Quantum Circuits, having British Patient Capital (BPC), strongly there as one of the investors, and I think those involvements are very pertinent in signalling to other investors to come in. This is an aspect of a dynamic in the market I think we're going to see more and more of.
Yeah, certainly, the U.S. government has put out, several grants to people. They don't typically invest, but they'll put out grants, and that's always a good sign that if the government trusts you, maybe as an investor, you might be a good company too. So, but what other, I think, key financial news that is coming up very shortly is D-Wave. Appears that they're going to be completing their SPAC merger with DPCM Capital. Of course, there's a lot of questions right now on whether the SPAC market will continue. It looks like D-Wave is going to get under the gun. Their registration documents were declared effective by the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, and they've scheduled a shareholder vote on August 2nd. So I would expect that within the next month or so we'll see a public listing for D-Wave. The question, though, is how it will turn out, whether the existing shareholders of DPCM will cash in or not. There is a bonus pool if they don't cash in, but we'll have to see, because I know when Rigetti did their SPAC completion, there was a fair number of investors in the SPAC who decided to cash in, and we'll have to see if that happens with D-Wave or not.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how much of it they get to keep. And I was surprised because I thought the market was SPAC'd out, so to say, and then the economic clouds were looming. I also think that those who wanted to have their chips on the table already have. And what I'm seeing now in terms of investment analysis is more application driven. And I think when investors double click on exactly what system can do what for what application, many times they conclude that it's too early and that it's okay as kind of a future oriented, we want to make sure we have a play in this area, and it moves to what can it do for me right now. And then what can it do for me right now is like moving all towards emulators and simulators, which I think is going to be a growing market.
Even though it is pretty early for a lot of potential use cases of quantum computers, it is really important to know where the inflection point is for how many qubits, what level of error correction you really need in order to show an actual advantage for a particular workload. And that's not, let's say, a broad quantum advantage, but for a specific workload. It is interesting to see that the D-Wave SPAC is going forward, especially given the changing regulations around SPACs in the US and kind of the market in general. I imagine they really want to have that wrapped up and ready before their Qubits conference later this year. So it will be interesting to see how the messaging for that plays out for D-Wave's annual conference. Getting back to the, let's say, government investment into quantum computing, because there's so much government money flowing at the moment for high technology and deep technology, it is interesting to see that this is happening, but it is really, really light compared to what the CHIPS Act is going to wind up being, assuming that it does reach final passage, which by all indications, it looks like it will.
I was just going to say that the geopolitics mathematics really hasn't changed. That's kind of been the same forever. But I think what is new in that world is the recognition by governments around the world that technology, and especially advanced technology, is the engine of economic growth for the next many, many years. And therefore, suddenly technology is becoming a political hot potato. And the number one item there really is fabrication capability, reliance on supply chain that right now is heavily concentrated in Asia as it relates to high-end chip manufacturing. So that is, it's reasonable to expect that to be the high priority. And we see that in the US, we see that in the EU, and there's pressure on ASML to not ship their fabrication equipments, ship more to West than East, so to say. So that entire chip supply chain becomes a really big issue. Quantum computing is right behind it. But as James was saying, it's not probably the number one priority right now. And the US government, for its part, has been funding research around the world, not just in the US, which I think is also significant. So there is really a lot of, I would say, strategic geopolitical considerations in this space.
Are we seeing a bifurcation in the market where on one side we have projects that might be of strategic importance, even at the national level, such as Oxford Quantum Circuits in the UK and others that we have seen? On the other side, those that are closer to commercial success, like D-Wave, that has revenues exceeding the next 5 competitors combined, and almost 70% of it is commercial rather than R&D partnerships, and everybody else being left behind. Doug, you wrote about it in the quantum computing report. Will the recession affect quantum? David, you published something, Navigating the Quantum Storm. I just wrote about the quantum winter. Is this a new era, or what does this all mean?
I think we're entering a new phase, because I do think we're going to see, we have been, I think, at the peak of the hype cycles, particularly for quantum computing per se. And I think inevitably that changes as we go forward. I think there's a massive need for funding to scale these businesses up, but it is going to be difficult to get. We're going to have to help the conventional sources of private capital get into that and get behind that market and find the right routes. I wanted to flag one particular aspect of that. How you get the geopolitics of these, how governments can push a program rather than just one solution, because I think it's an interesting example. I think it's important to see Oxford Quantum Circuits is not just, one push. It's been picked up by the UK's NQCC, National Quantum Computing Centre. And the NQCC's backing for Oxford Quantum Circuits is an important part of their story. But it's almost, in my mind, the more significant part, because the NQCC itself is a commitment to an ongoing stake in scaling up this type of technology. So maybe Oxford Quantum Circuits will work out, but most people would say, well, we can't know exactly what's going to win. There's a lot of competition there. There's lots of other modalities. But the idea behind the government's backing for the NQCC is it's an ongoing effort specifically to scale up these devices. And some will succeed in that journey. Others will be replaced on the way as things take off. I think it's important to look at the strategy, not just a tactical investment in the short term.
One thing I would say is I always think that the path of the quantum industry is going to follow the path of other high-tech markets we've seen in past years. I mean, beginning with the automobiles industry 100 years ago, there were dozens and dozens of automobile companies, and it's pretty much shaken out. And we've seen it over and over again with semiconductors, with personal computers. And I do think that we'll see something similar in quantum. We have hundreds of quantum startups these days. And I think that, many of them will fall by the wayside. Some will be acquired. There's this concept called acqui-hire, where you buy a company just for its people. Some may just never get funding and will totally go out of business. And some, maybe their technology just doesn't work at all. So I do believe there will be a shakeout. But I would also point out that one of the limiters overall in the quantum market is the lack of people. Every company I talk to says that they have so much difficulty hiring people. So, the shakeout could be helpful in one way. But the other thing that I see also is that there's the high-tech industry in general is having some issues right now. And we're starting to see some layoffs at companies like Netflix, Tesla, some others. And, I wouldn't be surprised if some of those engineers will ultimately migrate to quantum. So there's a silver lining in the cloud if there is a recession. And the silver lining is that it might help this workforce issue.
Andre's original point of, is there a bifurcation in the market? I would say if there is one, it probably aligns more toward the idea of breaking down public key encryption and how that plays into national defense initiatives. And that's where a lot of the motivation for the government funding is coming from, versus the let's say more positive thing of building new things with quantum computers with math that hasn't really been practical to execute on a classical computer. So to me, it looks like the motivation for investment aligns along those two lines more than anything else. And to Doug's point about hiring, it is really, really, really interesting to see the hiring freezes. Google's having a 2-week hiring freeze this month, which is a rather interesting state of affairs. There is a blockchain startup that has rescinded offers that they've given out, which is never a good look for anyone. So it is really interesting to see how this job market is playing out for engineers and how many of those people will upskill to quantum computing.
I just wanted to make an aside remark, addressed perhaps a bit differently, directly to some of the quantum software engineers in the podcast audience, because we've often talked about the shortage of talent, and what that's meant in a lot of companies, a lot of stuff is salary levels within quantum have really been bid up, particularly in the software space, and I just would flag we're entering an era where a lot of companies are now perhaps not going to want to raise money for the next couple of years because the venture capital market's under pressure because of the tech slump. And so you've got a lot of companies saying, well, look, we've got to stretch our runway out. We need to conserve our cash, not be forced to raise money from a difficult market. And so they'll look at their bills, they'll look at their salary bills. And I think software engineers have to be, very talent in the market has to be very careful. You can walk in one day to your boss and demand a better package, or you're off, you're leaving. But there's a difficulty if you bid your own salary up, and then you end up in a sticky market where people are having to stretch to keep going. You've put yourself, regardless of your talent, in the firing line. So I would just urge people to be cautious about getting ahead of themselves in quantum market salary expectations at the moment.
And let's move on, leaving the investment world, where there is still money to be had. In fact, tremendous amounts of money sitting on the sideline. If you're of a strategic or even national importance, you certainly will have access to it. If you have a commercial near-term roadmap, you will have access to it. Otherwise, you'll probably need a really good reason to convince investors. And picking up on James' sobering note, let's see what people are still building and take a look at the product and technology. And if they are building for good reasons, let's go down under first. News out of Australia that caught my eye, and I know others caught various news items out of Australia, but starting with Michelle Simmons' teams that announced the first ever quantum computing circuit. In a quantum computer, you have the computational unit with the qubit. You have control wires or lasers that initiate that qubit, then also are able to change that frequency for various purposes. And you have readout lines or other readout mechanisms to get the computational results from that. And these, depending on the current type of architecture, superconducting, trapped ion, and so forth, are huge machines that look like these famous chandeliers or big tables full of lasers and other optics. And Michelle Simmons' team put it on a tiny little chip, just like in classical computing, which has many, many consequences. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think the Australian effort is really interesting, and also notable that there is some US government funding in that project out there as well. And I think figuring out how to do nuclear spin instead of electron spin is a very clever and interesting process. And so I think it was a pretty big breakthrough in recent past that we got to continue to watch, but I'll let others comment on it too.
Yeah, I think it's always been notable, the SQC silicon quantum computing technology. It uses this ultra high tech HDL lithography, which is way more cutting edge than what we talk about in the conventional world. And it's one of its attractions has always been that you can potentially do this, not just fabricate your qubits, but fabricate the connections with the same technology to achieve that. And it's great to see them following through on that vision. But it obviously is still a long way to go and a long way to prove itself towards fully functioning qubits and fully functioning multi-qubit devices.
Yeah, they said they're going to have a 10 qubit device or prototype sometime next year, which I think is good progress based on where they are right now. If I understand it correctly, they're like two phosphorus atoms trapped inside silicon, and they both share one electron, and you can now manipulate them. So like I was saying in a couple of episodes ago, where do you find quantum effects? You find them everywhere. So the point is, where can you identify the precise modality of it, as we call it, and harness it? And this is a very interesting, it's an indication of where you might just find these things that are unlikely, but they have a lot of promise.
Yeah, one thing I would say is there's actually several companies that are working on this quantum dot type of technology. Intel's working on it. Another Australian company, Dirac, is working on it. Quantum Motion is looking at it. But the big difference between silicon quantum computing, Michelle Simmons' group, is the lithography that David just mentioned. It uses atomic layer deposition or something, where the other guys are using more standard deep UV or extreme UV, which is used in semiconductor fabs. So, the arguments of all these guys is that if you look at the die area of a quantum dot, you're able to fit many, many more qubits in a square millimeter of silicon. And that allows you to potentially could allow you to scale up to very high numbers of qubits. But the other guys are saying, look, we really want to be compatible with the semiconductor fab. Intel, for example, is using their high volume semiconductor fab in Portland, Oregon to build their chips. And they say that is actually going to be a better approach just from a manufacturing standpoint. And of course, Silicon Quantum Computing is saying, yeah, but our because we're using such a high-tech lithography, we can be more precise. So again, it'll see which one of those win out. But if any of those guys are successful, it definitely has a potential to become a very important technology for quantum.
Yeah, just
on.
following up Doug's point, it's just a great example. That contrast Doug's painting, we can tend to paint one quantum qubit modality in very broad brush, say, oh, it's silicon spin. But as Doug's just illustrated, these are radically different, two different things that are being sometimes covered with one bucket. And I think we always have to keep our eyes open to that.
So one consideration for the silicon approach is that depending on what the technology is, the purity of silicon is a spectrum. So the Australians have to get the right isotope of silicon, and purification at that level is not easy, right? So the question is, how can you scale the entire supply chain, not just one part of it?
There was actually just an announcement, I think it was yesterday, by a company called Silex, which supplies raw wafers, that they are putting together a facility that will supply those types of wafers. Basically, silicon that uses the isotope that has zero spin.
Wow.
Let's throw another architecture into the mix and see how that compares. Last time we also spoke about the Continuum's 20 qubits on the Honeywell machine and how that relates to some of these bigger numbers that we hear. Now we just spoke about the quantum circuit, which might have 10 qubits and what that means. D-Wave came out with an update on their product roadmap, Advantage 2, which is now available with 500 qubits over the cloud. And the ultimate release of that system a year and a few months from now aims to have 7,000 qubits, a much bigger number. They use a different quantum computing architecture. What does that mean?
I think it just means they're continuing on their roadmap. That they at their last Qubits conference they said that they're working on this. So it's quite reasonable for them to build a smaller version of the 7,000 qubit machine, and getting feedback from customers is always important. So to the extent that they can offer this 500 qubit machine on the cloud and get some people to use it, they may learn something about that architecture that they can apply to the full size machine when they have it available in a year or two.
Yeah, I think the cloud action obviously really makes sense for a technology like this, because people do need to kick the tires, and those who are offering cloud do need to provide a variety of capabilities to their customers. So both the supply and demand part of it really work well. As the OG quantum computing company, they are ahead in my mind in terms of the applications that they know they can run and customers who actually are running them. And we talked earlier about having commercial customers. So that actually is a good segue into, like James, you were talking about the cybersecurity part. What I'm observing is that really the application is starting to become more important, at least in the conversations I'm a part of, that people are interested in what can this thing do rather than what is it. And if you can do a good job on optimizations or fraud detection or whatnot, then indeed that's a good solution. And likewise with the cybersecurity, people are now saying that, okay, this is a good quantum computing technology, but does it do for cryptanalysis? Does it do well for this particular application? And maybe for this particular application, ion trap might be better than photonics, for example. I think those kinds of discussions are starting to happen more frequently, in my view.
I just follow up on that and say I think it's one of the reasons why the D-Wave SPAC is in my view an easier place than some of the other ones we've seen. And it's not really the SPAC per se; it's the ending up being on a public market. Because my take is to make a success of that, you've really got to talk a strong. You've got to have some strong metrics you can talk about, and particularly revenue is the one that people want you to talk about. And the great thing about whatever you think of the D-Wave technology and the competition it will face from wherever, it's had this long history of working with potential customers and trying things out, and now getting some deployments. And you can say, oh, there'll be competition here and there, but they've got real customers with real deployments, and that makes it easier for them to have a narrative about their revenue that they can control and sell to the market. And so I think they've got a good chance to go forward with that story.
And talking about real use cases, Rigetti also expanded their capabilities with a new Aspen machine, 32 superconducting qubits in the UK. And they specifically mentioned the collaboration with the Oxford Instruments, University of Edinburgh, Facegraph, but also Standard Chartered Bank. And this is about financial modeling, risk management, and so forth. At the same time, Google came out with a virtual machine, and they positioned this specifically to help people learn how to use quantum, Shahin, but then to accelerate research, so more on the R&D side. Any thoughts on either of those two?
Let me say a couple things about Google. They just finished their Quantum Summer Symposium, and they did have a number of announcements that were in there. One of the first one was this quantum virtual machine that you just mentioned. Basically it's a simulator that has been programmed with all the various noise models and all the characteristics of the actual Google Sycamore processor. So, if you're a researcher and you're looking at things like noise mitigation strategies, that type of thing, it could be a useful tool. But if you aren't worried about noise, then maybe you just want to use one of the other simulators that are out there that are noiseless. There are some of the simulators also have noise models in there, but you may only have to approximate what the noise might be, versus apparently this quantum virtual machine from Google, you can actually use the noise models that are actually in the real hardware. But there's other things that they announced in this. First, I would mention that they just released version 1.0 of Circ. That program has been in development for several years. It was version 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, etc. So now they have an official 1.0 release. So apparently it's a sign they believe it's mature enough that more people could use it. They did announce, they wrote a very interesting paper, by the way, on fault tolerance, where they've been running experiments with various error correction codes, and they were able to show, really for the first time as far as I know, that they were able to improve the logical error rate by implementing more complex codes. They compared the results of a code that had a code distance 3 versus the one that had code distance 5. The one that had code distance 5 had more qubits, but it also showed a lower error rate. So it's showing that they're going in the right direction, and it really is a very significant milestone on their path. And for those of you who have not seen the videos from the Quantum Summer Symposium, I would recommend you see it. You can go to Hartmut Nevin's introduction, and he'll talk about that. It's quite interesting. I would also mention, by the way, that in that paper where they talk about the code distance, they very briefly mentioned that they have an upgraded version of the Sycamore processor that has 72 qubits. The version that they used in 2019 for the what they call beyond classical experiment. I guess quantum supremacy is not politically correct anymore, so they use beyond classical. That was 54 qubits, or or 53 qubits because one didn't work.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
this new version has 72. So, they are continuing on their thing, and they apparently are on their roadmap to have a 1 million qubit processor by the end of the decade.
So in the interest of time, I'll move us along because we have a couple more important things to discuss. There was also an announcement, James, I'm picking on you now, BASF collaborating with Pascal to predict weather patterns. So people are still working on some use cases, but let's take this a level farther down to the algorithms that drive this. We have many algorithms to date, really only two that matter, Shor, to find prime factors of integers, and Grover, which is a search algorithm. And a new paper, which is still in preprint, was just published. Verifiable quantum advantage without structure. And it is an algorithm that supposedly allows you to find the results of a random oracle with probability 1 while respecting the Arison-Ambanis conjecture, which basically states the need for structure and structured data to deliver quantum speed up. I read the paper, but definitely need some help understanding it. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, no, I'd like to do that because I'm very excited about this result. As you say, it's just an e-print, so maybe it'll be shot down. But this is big news. This is on my short list of most important developments this year so far. This is it's a new algorithm. We don't hear so much about new. We hear lots of algorithm developments, but really it's variations on old themes. And this is something new, and it's really it comes from a really unexpected direction from me, because I think we'd all slightly probably misunderstood the Arison-Ambanis conjecture, and the thing this new algorithm's pointing out is that conjecture applies, and what it's saying is you can't have an exponential quantum speed up unless you've got structure in the problem. But what this new algorithm points out is that conjecture, the Arison-Ambanis conjecture, really applied specifically to decision problems, a specific type of problem. And they've gone to another very broad class of problems, NP search problems, and so the conjecture doesn't apply. And what they've done is they've put in place, all right, so this is how you can get an exponential quantum speed up. And yes, it's been shown principally in the quantum oracle model, which means it's not a concrete demonstration of the algorithm. It's a more theoretical explanation of where the speed up comes from. But it's oh yeah. To give you a bit of a sense, I would point people. There's a great YouTube video that Mark Zandri's done on the algorithm, which is I think reasonably accessible, and nothing. It doesn't break more cryptography per se, but it's really disconcerting that the whole discussion is being done in terms of attacks on primitives which are foundational primitives for symmetric cryptography. NP search is a way of tackling attacking a one-way function, to try to find a pre-image in a one-way function, which is at the heart of what keeps symmetric cryptography secure. And this algorithm, it no way breaks any of the actual algorithms we've got at the moment. There's no demonstration of that. But it is disconcerting that they show that you can construct from it one-way symmetric cryptography protocols for that, which would be classically hard, but would be quantum easy. So it's like, oh, so this is it's really interesting because it's suddenly a new quantum algorithm. But it's really, ooh, what are you talking about? And let's see what happens with this. This is very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas the two main ones are prime factorization, search. They're very concrete what they are. This one opens up a whole class of algorithms. So it almost like the floodgates have now opened, and then what will transpire, we don't know yet. And it feels really promising.
Good. This will be an exciting development to watch. We certainly need more opportunities to find good use cases, right, James? That allows to do things that really have not just quantum speed up, but business advantage and hopefully human advantage at some point. To wrap this up, just a couple minutes left. I struggled to keep us within quantum computing and kept being pushed by all of you into other fields. And maybe that is the trend in the market, right? And we have to talk about Nist or at least quantum security for a couple of minutes here. Don't get too excited. But in our preparation, one of you said that you believe in the near term there will be more revenue opportunity in the area of quantum security than in selling quantum computing hardware, software, or services. A pretty bold statement. Where are we at with Nist and quantum security, and why is this in the near term such an opportunity?
I'll go quickly. There was also a Quantum Security Act that the House in the US passed that is the trigger point for the government to mandate what departments need to do. And there's a whole government process that will be followed, but it was very significant. So the quantum security, the post-quantum, quantum resilient, quantum safe, all of those words are starting to be important things that people are paying attention exactly because of the harvest now, decrypt later problem that exists. But as I also was saying in last episode, I call this the unquantum market because you're trying to prevent quantum computers from operating rather than taking advantage of them. So we're not using quantum computers to encrypt. We're trying to avoid quantum computers to not encrypt. Now, if you add quantum teleportation, that becomes another piece if that ever materializes, and there's good progress there. And then there is the purely provable random numbers that can generate higher quality keys. That sort of feels like a gray area, but so those are really the only 2 or 3 areas that you can apply to the one. However, I do think the interest in it is rising rapidly, and the government mandate is going to absolutely make it a big market. And then how do you get these Nist algorithms and actually implement them? So that is itself another market segment.
Yeah, one thing I would point out is I think if you talk with most IT managers, they're certainly aware of Shor's algorithm and the potential problems that large quantum computer could happen in the future, but they've been taking a wait and see attitude. But I think the key event was earlier this month when Nist announced their selection of the first 4 algorithms. I think that's going to kick off a bunch of projects and various IT managers saying, okay, now that there's some algorithms that have been blessed by Nist, we ought to put together a program to upgrade our capability. As I've said in other forums, it's sort of like Y2K all over again. The initials people use is Y2Q, years to quantum. And, there are a bunch of companies out there that will provide consulting and services to help people on this journey, because it's not trivial. You just can't pull out like an RSA algorithm out of your server and plug in, something else, some lattice-based thing that's post-quantum thing. There's a lot of things that you have to test. The latencies are different, the key sizes are different, the ciphertext sizes are different, and there's going to be a lot of activity there. And I do believe that for these companies that are offering services in this area, there's going to be a lot of revenue possibilities because it's now, and I think IT managers would be willing to lay out POs in the next few years to get this done.
I agree. I think it's the Nist having now got to this point where it's selected the algorithms for protocols for standardization is a seminal moment that helps kickstart that. I just want to make a couple of observations about what were some of the slight surprises in the Nist announcement. And I think one is a really positive surprise. We were talking about geopolitics and what countries can agree what early on. And one of the things that went really right here was obviously a behind-the-scenes deal between Nist in the US and French government and CNRS, who own a patent that was endangering the adoptability of the algorithm Kyber that Nist wanted to select. And for a long time, it looked like, well, this was going to be a showstopper and that we'd have to select some other algorithm, and that was going to be a shame. And I think it was interesting that it just happened. The Nist announcement was delayed inexplicably for a long time. And then it just so happens that 2 days after the G7 summit and the day after the NATO summit, suddenly Nist are able to put out their announcement saying, yeah, oh, and by the way, we've got an agreement with CNRS that the patent is going to be grandchilded into people adopting the standard. And that's really positive that behind the scenes, that kind of agreement has been able to happen. So hats off to all the people that made that happen and gave us a better solution. There's another observation I just wanted to flag, because for me it was a surprise. Obviously, the selected algorithm Kyber is what's called a structured lattice crypto protocol, and it has to be lighter weight to fit in the type of challenge that Doug was describing. I was surprised that they didn't also decide to standardize Frodo Chem, which is a fully unstructured lattice and more secure because of that. It's not usable in a lot of use cases because of the extra overheads, but I'm surprised that they're not also standardizing the heaviest duty lattice they could. I guess they're going to be seeing the classic McAleese in round 4 as the alternative heavy duty solution, but I was surprised that there wasn't a full grade lattice one there.
I just want to highlight the patent issue that David raised, because it's always a big issue in standards that you don't want to mandate the use of something that includes royalty payments and friction that causes people to, like, now if you're on the other side of it, that's pretty sweet business. Suddenly your market is made for you, but it is an extremely difficult thing, and it's wonderful that they've managed to address that.
James, so use cases are moving to encryption. Final words here.
So yeah, there's definitely going to be a ramp up in go-to-market activity from security vendors who want to take advantage of the Nist standardization process. Security can be sometimes a little bit like selling insurance. There's always going to be a new threat out there, and you have to protect yourself from it. But the way that this is communicated to the market, I think there's definitely room to be a little. It's important to balance being direct and being, let's say, eloquent in the way that you're really delivering this message. Having a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about what the actual risk is at the moment, I think is still an interesting balance for everyone to try to strike.
Well, I'm speaking with Jack Hidary later this week, founder and CEO of Sandbox IQ. They are making a $1 billion bet on this with some very, very credible friends on their team. So I'll report back what they have to say on this topic. Probably no surprises there. That we will conclude season 1, episode 7 of the Analyst Roundtable. Thank you for joining us once again. Round and round we go.